we will be recording it because people quite often access them afterwards, and they've been so good that also people are wanting to use them for referring to in their teaching. We'd like to get the debate going, so if you'd like to take part via social media, we are #KU Book Club and or at the KU Big Read. And the book club, as I say, was a new initiative this year, really because of the odd circumstances we're in, and we've had a weekly presentation by a member of staff on a particular chapter of the book ever since early June. So we've been going quite a long time, and Emma is our penultimate speaker. So I'm just going to play a welcome from Emily Maitlis, and then I'll introduce Emma.
Hello, I'm Emily Maitlis and welcome to the Big Read Book Club. I'm so thrilled that my book, Airhead, The Imperfect Art of Making News, is this year's Big Read book. I really hope that you're enjoying it and that you enjoy these book club talks, which will look at some of the stories from the book in more detail. And the events within these pages are, I guess, some of the most funny, challenging, significant or changing of my career, and it is a huge thrill and a compliment to me to know that you'll be discussing them. I hope you find the talks interesting. Best of luck.
Thank you very much indeed. So we were very pleased to get Emily Maitlis as our Big Read book author this year. And obviously she's very much in the news at the moment, not only presenting it, but also being part of it from time to time. So we're very, very pleased to have her. And also she's been very enthusiastic in her contribution. Right, so now to turn to our speaker, who's displayed in glorious Technicolor in front of you. Emma is actually my colleague. She's the course leader for MA Publishing, and she's also responsible for Kingston University Press. And in fact, I'm speaking from the office we share on campus. Her publishing career started with the BBC Books in the editorial department, but she's worked for many other publishers, including Pan Macmillan, and she had 13 years at Headline Books, which is part of Hachette. She's worked there as a commissioning editor and later as a publisher. Now, I know from working with her that she's passionate about fiction, but she's always worked in a professional capacity on non-fiction, and she's worked with some really famous and high-profile authors throughout her career, including chefs, actors, TV presenters, reality TV stars, rock musicians and comedians, which of course the students always really enjoy hearing first-hand anecdotes from the world of publishing. And she's worked with many of these authors on autobiographies and loves learning about other people's lives, which is pretty much a quality for being a publisher in general. We need to be nosy, don't we, Emma? She continues to freelance in the publishing industry, and of course that's a massive benefit to our course because she's reporting firsthand from what's going on. So over to you, Emma. You're going to talk for sort of 15-20 minutes and then we'll have an opportunity for questions.
Yes,
take it away.
Thank you, Alison, for your very succinct account of my professional career so far. Alison alluded to the fact I started at BBC Books, so my early career was very much around television tie-ins and the media and that sort of publishing, but obviously our television is very centred around the personalities on our televisions, and so over the years it's kind of evolved to involve a lot more autobiography of famous people, as Alison says, but also people who are not famous but have yet shared their life stories with us. And what I wanted to talk about today was really to maybe give you a little bit more of an insight into what the role of an editor is, because my experience over the years is that people think that what editors do is correct spellings, and we do a little bit more than that. And also think about the nature of autobiography and how an editor works with an author who is actually telling their own story, and the kind of the sensitivities that there are around that. So I was going to start with talking about what an editor does. And as I say, people don't understand. I've spent many times in the days when I worked in house and I got taxis from one place to another for meetings, trying to explain to taxi drivers exactly what it was that I did as an editor. And I'm going to actually quote from one of the books that is in the university library, which is this book, Carol Blake's book, From Pitch to Publication. Carol Blake was a very well-loved literary agent who died just 2 or 3 years ago. And she really sums it up really well in her book about editors. And about this book is aimed at authors, but kind of tries to make it clearer for them. And she says, the title of editor is used to cover so many different functions, but it is used indiscriminately in publishing. So it's no wonder that authors can be confused as to who does what. There are basically 3 different functions and at least 2 different jobs, which were all covered by the catch-all term editor. And the 3 functions she highlights are the commissioning editor, the structural editor, and the copy editor. I would actually add a 4th to that, because she's aiming her book at novelists, the project editor, which is something that I do quite a lot of, particularly for complex illustrated books. So very briefly, because this is not a lecture on the editorial process, and those of you who are joining us today, who may be joining us on our courses in a couple of weeks' time, I will come back to this in more detail. But just to kind of, the commissioning editor is very much on the business side. They're the person that maybe has the idea for the book, or is approached by an author or their agent with a book idea, and they look at the commercial viability of that idea and really look after that author throughout the publishing of that book. That person may also be the structural editor, and the structural editor is the person that really looks at the book and considers the story that the author wants to tell, the content that's in there, and works with them to shape the book. And then the copy editor is the person who corrects the spellings, but they don't just correct the spellings, they do loads of other things as well. And interestingly, I've been speaking with some people in industry about the sort of skills that they want our students to have. And one of them commented that the real skill of the copy editor is the understanding that there are unknown unknowns, and they really ought to check them. So the copy editor is also responsible for making sure the facts are right, and you've named the shop correctly that they say they buy something and things like that. So those are the kind of the 3 roles. I have done all 3. I no longer commission because I don't work in-house, but I do an increasing amount of structural work, and that's where a book like Emily's book really excites me, because I look at the structure of this and I wonder about the decisions that were made in terms of how she was going to present these stories, what is left in and what is taken out, and why that might be. I've attended 2 of these webinars previously, the first one with our colleague from the journalism department, Fiona O'Brien, and the second with Nick Foxton from the creative writing team. And it's been really interesting to see their perspectives on it. And I'm kind of hoping to respond to some of the things that were raised in those webinars today. So I hope that further on, and when we get into the questions section, we can talk about what we understand an autobiography to be. It was very interesting in Nick's session that people approach this book expecting an autobiography, and certainly the way it's presented is very much in line with how publishers present autobiographies. They didn't necessarily get quite what they expected, and I said in that session that I see this as autobiographical writing rather than an autobiography. And these are sort of publishing distinctions that we might make, but the public don't make. And how we communicate what something is to the public is very much part of what a publisher does. So the truth is, we may want the public to believe this is an autobiography, and that may attract certain people to buy it, even if it's not perhaps a full autobiography. And it was interesting that quite a lot of people on that webinar felt that there were bits missed out that they wanted to be there. That is always the case. And how you deal with those things is really interesting. Publishers also sometimes make a distinction between an autobiography and a memoir, and I'd be very interested to hear whether you all feel there is a distinction between those two things. So I'm hoping that I've kind of put a few ideas out there, and then we can have a conversation about them. Alison said in her introduction how I'm a real reader of fiction, which I absolutely am. I tend to read fiction for pleasure, but also what I would describe as a publisher as narrative non-fiction, and that's non-fiction that tells a story, and so often that is autobiographical, where non-fiction is telling a story. And this idea of how the book is structured, and whether you want to go from the beginning to the end and through it, and that's how, as an editor, you will often be working with an author to decide what is going to be the best structure and how they can best tell their story. And this is all very much kind of with respect for what they do and don't want to include in that book. My perception is people think an autobiography is going to start with childhood and bring them right up to date. Actually, I got a load of autobiographies around me today, and so few of them actually tell somebody's entire life story. And certainly Emily's isn't attempting to do that, and has been structured in such a way that the reader doesn't expect it to do that. So it was interesting that people still felt there were kind of gaps in it. So the chapter I sort of picked out for today was the chapter called 27 Years On, which I have turned the corner of the page over. Is that the right page? No. And in that, there are two things that she says. So firstly, I'm going to read just a couple of quotes from the beginning of this chapter, and this is why I chose it, less to do with the content and more to do with the process of putting the book together. So first of all, she says, when I first decided to write a book, that is, write down some of the extraordinary encounters I'd had over the years and pray to God it would actually start to feel like a book. So this is very much about how the content is structured, and how you do make a lot of disparate stories, such as in Emily's book, into a book. And then the other thing that I really wanted to pick up on is just further down in that same opening paragraph, about the stalking that she has encountered over the years. And she said, she told her publishers, who are Penguin, the one thing I don't want to write about, I explained, is stalking. I was terrified that the end product would turn into a whinge about my stalking horrors, a sensationalized account of life as a victim. I couldn't think of anything worse. They were instantly sympathetic. They got it, and we agreed that a red line had been drawn. As an editor, I find that fascinating, not least because the remainder of that chapter is all about stalking. And I can well imagine the meeting in which the publishers nodded and agreed that we wouldn't go into that in the book. That's obviously not something that you want to include, Emily, whilst also thinking it really would be good from a commercial and marketing point of view if she would talk about this slightly more personal, very personal part of her life in a book that is mainly, I would say, professionally autobiographical rather than personally autobiographical. And in the session with Nick, Kelly Squires, who works with Alison, raised a really interesting point about how the duty of the publisher and the editor to protect the author, perhaps from oversharing and other things like that. And that is a big part of what we do as a structural editor. You're constantly balancing up what you as a publisher want to be in that book, because you recognize that that's what your reader will want to read about, with what the author feels comfortable putting in the book. You also sometimes have to balance up things that the author wants to put in the book, and for various reasons, the publisher does not want to put in the book. These can vary from legal things, which I will talk about a little bit, because autobiography is a legal minefield, which I've become more and more expert in, but also personal things. One of the things I think is really, really important to understand about, and as an editor to recognise when you're editing autobiographical works, is this is somebody's life. These are people that they care about. This is, you know, it isn't a story they've made up. It's not something they're writing about from an objective point of view. It is their life. So you have to be very tactful when they tell what they believe to be a hilariously funny anecdote, which has a certain you had to be there element about it, and how you kind of steer around that and perhaps suggest that maybe they don't want to put that in, maybe they don't want to overshare. I've certainly had authors who were inclined to overshare. If you go into the reality star area, a lot of oversharing goes on in that part. Do you want it on paper forever? Are you quite sure you want that in there? So balancing those things is a big part of what I do. Legal, obviously, an autobiography, a publisher will always employ a lawyer to read an autobiographical work and ensure that the author is not mistakenly libeling anyone. And this is a fascinating area of publishing, and something that's really evolved in my time since I've been an editor and has become more and more important. And have to admit, we used to be a bit more laissez-faire about it 20 years ago, and now we're absolutely assiduous in our checking of authors' manuscripts. And as an editor, you become familiar with the sort of areas that you know will be problematic, and also creatively finding ways round them. And so it's very much a collaborative process when you do a structural edit with an author, in finding ways that they are comfortable with telling their story and you as the publisher feel are protecting them. I've worked with quite a number of doctors, so as well as the issue of libel, they have their professional responsibility to their patients of confidentiality. How do you get around these things? These are things that, you know, over the years you find your ways. I'm an expert in knowing when to change the name, change locations. And I think that brings us also on to kind of questions of truth, and how true any autobiographical writing truly is. And we can get into quite philosophical debates about truth and perceptions of truth, but also quite pragmatic ones where, I'm sorry, you really can't tell that story in here because otherwise somebody is going to sue you. It does happen. I've been at publishers where that has happened, and nobody likes it. So that's kind of something that you've always got to have in mind with autobiography. So where am I? So I'm up to 19 minutes past, Alison. I was going to actually just one thing before I kind of open it for questions, because those are kind of the broad areas I hope that we can all talk about. But in terms of this idea that Kelly raised about sharing and what authors want to share and what they don't want to share, obviously I sensed with Emily that she approached this as very much a professional piece of writing. And what I'd be fascinated to know is whether it was her idea or whether it was a publisher's idea. So did the publisher go to her and say, Emily Maitlis, we know we can sell a book written by you? Or did Emily Maitlis speak to her agent and say, I really want to write a book? And depending on which way round it was, it can sometimes really explain why certain decisions have been made about the book. My suspicion is that this came from a publisher. When I was in-house, we all had our wish lists of high-profile people that we really wanted to work with. Top of mind was always Victoria Wood. The comedian, for those of you who don't know Victoria Wood, every year I saw her agent for lunch, and every year her agent said, Victoria doesn't really want to do it. And I have to be honest that when Victoria Wood died without doing it, I did feel a bit good for you, Victoria. You stuck to your guns. There's an authorised biography, however, coming out of Victoria Wood this autumn. And in the blurb on Amazon, it does say that she did say she would do it one day. But now somebody's doing it on her behalf. So I wonder whether Emily was on Roland White or Ariel, her editor, who she credits in the back of the book in the acknowledgements, whether she was on their wish list and whether that's how this book came about. But and I think that kind of balancing of kind of persuading somebody that they do want to write the book, but making sure that they feel comfortable with the book that they're putting out there and they don't feel that they're overexposing themselves is really important.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. So I've been making notes while you've been talking. Let's start with the actual structure of the book. I mean, my wonder is that actually it's become a sort of career stage for prominent BBC people to write books. So Michelle Hussein has written, it came out almost exactly the same time as Emily Maitlis's one, and Jenny Murray has, I think she's it was her idea to write books. But there seems to be a divide between how people read this book. So I've noticed that scientists or people with a sort of science background tend to start at the beginning and keep going. And people from a sort of more arts background tend to dip around, which is the way I read it. And I found, I don't want to insult our author, but I found it a bit annoying that there weren't any running heads at the top to tell me whose interview I was in, because I started with Prince Andrew and then went to President Trump and then on to, and so I was dotting around all over the place. And in terms of structure, do you think that the person in your role should have anticipated that people might read it like that and put in the guide to help people navigate the book if they weren't going to read it chronologically?
I absolutely agree with you, Alison. I hadn't spotted it myself, but I also read it in the way that you read it, in that I dipped in and out of it. I am a bit prone to do that with autobiography anyway. I sometimes just look in the index to kind of first of all look up the stories that I'm really interested to hear. Like in Michelle Obama's, I wanted to find out when she first met Barack Obama, so I went straight to that bit. But yeah, I do think, and again, without being critical of the book, I spoke earlier on about the narrative arc and storytelling, and I think one of the things that I found a bit disappointing about this book, and why to me I don't see it really as an autobiography or even a memoir, is that it has no narrative arc. It really lacks a narrative arc. It's a number of great individual short pieces, but they're not threaded together. And I think if I was editing it, I would have wanted to see her make more connections.
Yes, because we don't know the dates that these interviews were conducted, which again I found a bit irritating, because the Trump one was quite a long time ago and then others are much more recent. And I think it'd be very helpful if she'd given, or if the editor had suggested perhaps a line or two of context about how it came to take place.
I think that would have been, and the simple thing of the running heads, I would always say running heads, the only reason we have running heads in books is to help people navigate the book.
Perhaps we ought to explain what they are, because you and I know the job.
So the running head, I'll put my copy up. So here we have Airhead on the left, and on the right we have Emily Maitlis, who is the author. Convention is that either, I have to say that breaks with all conventions. Convention is that either you have the author on the left and the title on the right, so I would have not done it this way around anyway, or you have the book title on the left and the chapter title on the right, which in this book I think would have been more useful. But I do think there's a kind of the bigger issue of whether it tells a story or not. Even the two Grenfell chapters, which are obviously next to each other and closely related, sequential, she starts the second of the Grenfell chapters, which is the one where she's talking about Theresa May and interviewing Theresa May, without any acknowledgement that she's just finished a chapter about Grenfell, which I, as an editor, would have wanted. So for me, if I'd been working with her, I would have wanted to see more connection made and more attempt to tell her story, be that even though it is separate, and there are obviously lots of things she hasn't put in there, and that's the important thing. You don't have to put everything in your book, but I think there does, it needs some sense of a story. You kind of want to start it and feel that you want to turn the page and move to the end. And I don't think, I must confess, I haven't read every chapter of this book. I've dipped in and out of the ones that interested me, and probably have missed a few. That's meant I've missed a few along the way.
Yes, I had to push myself to read a few final ones. I think you're right, though, about the sort of, I found it a bit tantalising, these glimpses of her family that, again, with no chronology, but I'm very interested in her as a parent, in how she manages her life when she just disappears at no notice, and, you know, how that works at home. And we get these glimpses of the dog and the children in the changing rooms, but it would be good to, and also the llama incident, I found that very funny, when she's trying to coordinate her life to get back to an event with her sisters and the children's cousins. Yeah. But it is quite tantalising, isn't it? You want to know a bit more.
Yeah, and I think that's why in that last webinar that I was in, people felt disappointed, like bits had been missed out. I mean, the other reason things will have been missed out are absolutely for legal reasons as well. There'll be things, you know, I think it's been very skillfully approached from that point of view. You know, some very high profile people with reputations in the UK, which is what you're always asking when you're editing and doing a legal report. Does somebody have a reputation in the UK? Clearly everybody in the book does have, and I do think that's been balanced really well. But also, she, you know, Newsnight is still her job, and so she has had to be really careful about what she does say and what she doesn't say. I think it's different maybe when you're doing a more retrospective autobiography, when you're later in your career. People tend to write different sorts of books. I think we've, as an industry, autobiography has always played such a large part for non-fiction editors of what we do and what we're looking to buy as publishers and what we're looking to sell. And kind of finding ways of getting high profile people to do it, you know, in different ways that they be prepared to do it without kind of putting themselves on the line is
well, that's a really interesting point, actually, because Sandy Toksvig is somebody else who's always said she doesn't want to write an autobiography and has just written one. And I was listening to her being interviewed, and in fact the structure is really original because she takes a bus route from where she used to live to the BBC, and then at every stop she has a little meander off into experiences that she had locally and things that she thought. So it's absolutely not chronological. It's very original and very creative. But do you think that's going to be the way it moves forward, that we'll be commissioning autobiographies from people who don't really want to write them but trying to think of new formats?
We have been doing that for many years indeed, and I always, I do read a lot of the kind of the best-selling autobiographies because obviously professionally I need to do so. And there's been some really clever things like that. Dawn French did hers all as letters to Jennifer Saunders. That was a really clever structure. David Mitchell, not David Mitchell, the novelist, David Mitchell, the journalist and comedian and actor, I guess. He was walking to lose weight, so his sound is quite similar to Sandy Toksvig. An example that I wanted to mention, which I've even got my little prop here, which isn't a book I worked on. It's Matt Lucas, the comedian's autobiography, and his is alphabetical, which similarly has issues in terms of the narrative arc, but it's used really cleverly because there's an entry for each letter, obviously alphabetical, and I don't know if people listening know, but Matt Lucas's partner, after they separated, took his own life, but obviously this person was a massive part of Matt Lucas's life, and to write his life story without his partner Kevin in there would have felt like a gap, but clearly was really painful for him to write about. So what he's done is just this very short entry that basically says, Kevin was a wonderful person and I wish he was still here. And in what it doesn't say, it says so much more than what it does. And I really admire that for a very sensitive way of dealing with what is obviously a really painful subject for the author, but not just missing it out. I think that was, and so I think you can use structure. A lot of these examples are comedians. Peter Kay's autobiography, which sold hundreds of thousands of copies, by far the biggest seller of the year when it came out, probably 2006 or 7, finished when he was 18. Childhood memoir is often a way to kind of get around it. So yeah, as publishers, we're always kind of thinking about what is the angle, that's something that they might write about. One of the books I've worked on was the TV presenter Kate Humble, wrote a book about dogs and the dogs in her life, because that's something important for her.
Or My Family and My Animals and Other Family. Which
exactly. So I think actually the more satisfying books as an editor to work on are those where you're not just going and then this and then this and then this and then that. It's where you are. And in terms of, as publishers, we're always thinking about the market. And if we particularly know somebody, for example, with Kate Humble, where, she's known for kind of nature programs. So that's an angle that makes sense to us as a reader.
Yeah. Now, you talked about the author, sort of the editor's duty to protect the author. And I wondered about the sort of characteristic of the author who really wants to dish the dirt. And the particular one that, when I was thinking about this, that came to mind with me was somebody who'd been British ambassador to Washington, called Christopher Meyer, who'd, I think it was during the George Bush era, but he clearly had been released from his responsibility to stay quiet. Really wanted to dish the dirt, and said in interviews that he'd been encouraged by his editor to do just that. He was clearly something of an exhibitionist, because he entitled it Red Socks, I think, because he was always famous. He always wore red socks. But I just wondered if you'd ever been in that position where you're dealing with somebody who's either from vengeance or from just mischief, is really wanting to spill the beans, and if what kind of attitude you've taken.
So
is it your duty to protect them?
It's usually I have to turn to the bad cop of the lawyer when it comes to that. So I often work with the same lawyer. We have a really good relationship, and we will discuss things. We'll have long conversations on the phone about things, and I will kind of know that she's not going to like it. So I'll have kind of gone, we really wants to say this. How can we keep this in to keep the author happy while protecting them from potential libel? So that's when you can go through lots and lots of different rewrites, because it is the author's book, and you have to be respectful. Sometimes you have to draw a line, though. Sometimes you have to say, you just can't put that in. There's no way you can put this in. It's going to cause far too much trouble, going to put everybody really at risk. But yeah, I do use the bad cop lawyer sometimes to say, yeah, sorry, the lawyer says no.
And of course, we know that politicians quite often, the first thing they do is look in the index to see if they're included, and
absolutely.
We'll buy the book.
You'll notice that some autobiographies don't have indexes, and sometimes there's a good reason for that.
Oh, really?
People will deliberately not put an index in so that people can't go and find themselves in it. So they've actually got to read the whole book then.
Right. There's an interesting question come in from Birgit. How do you feel about anonymous authors? So if somebody wants to protect the identity of people they're writing about, and an obvious example there is the secret barrister.
Yes.
So does your editing change if somebody is writing under a pseudonym, and if so, how?
If somebody's writing under a pseudonym like the secret barrister, what you end up with is something that is actually a little bit of a hybrid between fiction and non-fiction, because and this can happen even with things that aren't written anonymously, but where it's so, because you're taking the essence sometimes of truth, and then but all the detail will have to be created around that to ensure that they're not kind of legally, it isn't legally problematic. If it is an anonymous author, you obviously have a little bit more leeway to do that. Similarly, with famous people, the public have a sense of who they think that person is, and they will know certain things about their lives. So in many ways, there's lots of things that as an editor that you can check and make sure you've got right. I spend a lot of time trying, particularly when you're working with reality TV stars, trying to see whether what they're talking about is in the public domain or not, whether they've already talked about it and the person they're talking about has not sued them, or whether actually it's something that isn't in the public domain. But where it's somebody who doesn't have a public profile, as I said, I've worked with kind of doctors, midwives, quite a few people in the medical professions. there certainly is some sort of creative license around that.
I was going to ask you about that actually. So with a book like Adam Kay's book,
Yes.
This Is Going to Hurt. Now the stories of the people, the names would have been changed, but people will be able to recognise themselves. Will all those stories have had to have been checked by the people they're about as to whether they're happy for them to be used?
If you're able to send a story to somebody who's in it, then that's always your first choice, and that's the first thing that you would say, particularly so when you write an autobiography, you do actually have to get, if you write about your brother or your mother or your father, we do have to get written confirmation that they've read the sections about them. I would imagine in Adam Kay's book, it would have been quite difficult to track those people down, particularly because he's no longer employed as a doctor, he's not in that hospital. It all happened quite a few years previously to him publishing the book. So as well as changing names, we would change a lot of identifying details. So the ideal would be that actually those people cannot recognize themselves, that the details are sufficiently changed that you don't open a book by a doctor and go, well, that's me, I can tell it's me. And I've spent a lot of time working on things like that to just ensure that just places, family situation, background, kind of just
changed a bit.
Sort of those details. So I think quite a lot like that will have been changed in that book.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's an interesting question here from Claire. So with the proliferation of all these celebrity autobiographies, I mean, there've been some spectacular successes, but there've also been some really abject failures, and you can always tell which they are because in January they'll be sitting by the till with a really knocked down price. So do you have, and they're not necessarily people who aren't really famous, so do you have a secret? Is there a magic ingredient for what makes a big seller in that sort of celebrity category?
Sadly, no, is the simple answer. So for those people whose job it is to commission autobiography, it is one of the highest risk areas of publishing, because it generally commands a huge amount of money, particularly when you're, dealing with people, famous people, sportsmen particularly, very expensive because they're earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a week. So if you want to persuade them to do their book, you've got to make it financially worth their while. So it is really high risk in terms of the investment. Not always, but often you're paying out a lot of money. And so we, all people buying autobiography hope that theirs is going to be the big one. There are safer bets, some safer bets than others. Sports a particularly interesting one because you're actually speculating on how successful they're going to be or how successful their team is going to be. So 2008, I think it was, England did very, very badly in the World Cup for football, but lots of people had invested in their high profile players and were bringing out their books in the autumn, and lost hundreds of thousands of pounds as a result of that, completely beyond the control of the publisher. The publisher has just got to take a gamble effectively on that based on, and that's why you do have specialist sports publishers who really kind of have, but nobody can in the end predict the result. The most impressive one I've seen like that was when England won the Rugby World Cup in 2003, and I was at Headline then, and we published Martin Johnson's autobiography, and he was the captain, and we had it out within 2 weeks of the win. And the sports editor said in the meeting, I remember saying, we are going to win. We're going to pay for this book and we are going to win. But clearly it might not have been if it hadn't been for Johnny Wilkinson in the last minute. So.
Right. So publishers are watching the fixtures with a sense of fun.
Absolutely. You feel much more invested.
It is quite culturally specific though, isn't it? We had an Italian student on our course. It was before you started actually, Emma, and I remember him because he did his dissertation all about sports autobiographies, because he was fascinated the difference between the two cultures, that in Italy apparently you wait till the end of your career and then you publish your autobiography, and he thought it was really strange that in Britain we have sequential autobiographies from sports players or books about them, whereas actually there'd just be one in Italy at the end of the career. So quite
we ran out of end of career sports autobiographies in this country in about 2005. Like, it really was like every legendary footballer had done it. And I think then people started kind of getting people early, trying. So you'd kind of, I can think of examples where an editor has maybe asked somebody, and this is a bit like Emily. I'm sure that Penguin are hoping to do more books with Emily. So they're probably hoping to get that end of career book from her, that kind of big journalistic memoir from her. But they've done this book, so there is a bit of a sprat to catch a mackerel approach.
So they lured her in, and then of course the end of the career book can tie up nicely with all those after dinner speaking events. And I remember that when the cricket umpire Dickie Bird retired and wrote his biography, he included it, or he had, very good at marketing, he had it included in the price of the dinner every time he spoke. And I think the publishers were just amazed at how many they sold.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot more of that. I mean, publishers have, I mean, at the moment, obviously in COVID, events have had to take a back seat for publishers. And it's a really kind of bad timing, because over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I think publishers, in the same way that musicians have done, have recognized that the live event is where they can kind of bring in audiences and make money. And that kind of ticket, talk and book ticket, has been on the increase. I mean, as you know, Alison, over the last few years, and now we're sort of at a point where there are fewer of those events. I mean, there's been whole production companies set up specializing in author tours, where authors go around and you buy a ticket to see them and you get the book.
I think, answering Claire's question about what's the magic, I mean, I've often thought it's who do you want to take home with you? Who are you happy to have sitting on your shelves? But then there are people who other people have disapproved of, who the book has been so good. And the classic example there is McEnroe, where a lot of people disapprove of him, but it was written by a really good journalist. And the book sold really, really well. But for me, the low point was when, and it seemed a really daft decision, when they commissioned the autobiography. Do you remember when they had Celebrity Big Brother and they introduced a non-celebrity? And then they commissioned her autobiography. Well, of course, she was a non-celebrity, so there wasn't a lot to tell. And that to me seemed it wasn't going to be a great idea. I wanted to talk briefly about the ideal length of an autobiography, or a biography, because we've just had the first volume of Kennedy, a really scholarly book on Kennedy, and it hasn't even got up to him running for president. So, I mean, it's a really slim section of his life. And at the same time, a couple of years ago, we had the students work on a biography, of Mandela, Nelson Mandela, written by Lord Peter Hayne. And its USP was that A Long Walk to Freedom had been too long for anybody. Lots of people owned it, but they hadn't actually read it. Do you think there is room in the market for different lengths of lives of the same people, aimed at different market groups?
I do, and I think that's possibly something that publishers don't exploit as much as they might do. I think, like Kennedy, when you're talking about a political autobiography or biography, people have a certain expectation of a certain length, and it kind of adds an authority and a sort of literary element to it. I'm thinking on my shelves, we've got the 2-part Elvis biography, which is very attractively, the spines match very nicely. And, you know, those kind of big people like that, they need to be of a certain length. But I think where it depends on the market a lot, but I think it is an opportunity to reach different markets by publishing books in slightly different formats for different people. One thing that I've often considered more recently is so your standard length for an autobiography in the sort of field I work in, which is kind of mainly entertainment people, is sort of 80 to 100,000 words. You might get 120,000 words, but you would be like, oh, this is going to be a bit of a long one. Less than 80 starts being a bit slim, and you have to put a lot of space in your typesetting. But making a kind of a version that's accessible maybe to less confident readers, but who are interested in that person, or younger readers. An example where this did happen was Malala, the Pakistani activist, and her book. There's a young person's version of that as well. And
Yes.
I think there's scope, sports, there's lots of evidence about losing boys as readers in teenage years, lots of sports personalities they might be interested in, or and young women as well, sort of young boys particularly. And is there a market for sort of edited versions of those books? Michelle Obama, I think, would be a fantastic example of somebody whose book is really inspiring, and a more accessible version.
Well, I noticed that the quick reads came out, the new batch of quick reads came out on Literacy Day, which was yesterday, wasn't it? And Caitlin Moran, there's a short version of hers, and actually the same with Adam Kay. He was in the previous selection, so that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the legal read to ensure that you're not libeling people, but of course I noticed that this talk has got a high turnout, actually, which lots of people who are interested in writing autobiographies. But I just wanted you to confirm that, in fact, it's the author who has to take the risk on this, because as an author, part of your contract is you have to absolve the publisher of risk, don't you?
Yes.
Do you think that would ever happen, that they go after the author?
Yes, it would happen. I have known it to happen.
Right.
But the publisher also has a duty to their author. So it would be sometimes legal cases have happened because of so if you serialize a book in a newspaper, so that's one of the things, that's something we can do as publishers, is sell the rights so that a newspaper can have the story first. They will pick out the most sensational bits. So the original approach from somebody who feels they've been libelled may well be to the newspaper where the serial has been published. So in the end, everybody then gets embroiled in it. So yes, the contract, technically the contract is that the author, so we are very much protecting the author. It also happens, and because libel law is different in the States than it is in the UK. In the States, the onus is on the libelled person to prove what has been said is untrue. In the UK, the onus is on the person who has made the statement to prove that what they've said is true. So American legal read doesn't necessarily, you have to do a UK legal read as well, and that's sometimes where slip-ups can happen.
That's interesting. So, question from Natalie: how do you, as a publisher, identify a market? Do you do market research? Do you have a panel of consumers as readers who you consult, or is it instinct?
It's a bit of instinct. It's a bit of being really kind of, as if you are commissioning in this area, you do have to watch I'm a Celebrity, and you do have to follow all the sports if you're the sports publisher, so people will have their interests and their expertise. And I think that's actually becoming more so. It's interesting that I think it's part of Orion have got a new imprint called White Rabbit, and they've recruited somebody from Faber whose specialism is entirely in music. And they're just buying music autobiographies. So you do get people with specialisms who really are, and maybe even come from that industry themselves. In bigger publishers, market research does happen. So there might be more formalized focus groups, panels. You might do a test. You might, certainly I've in the past had to kind of come up with 10 names of people who I'm interested in, and they would be put into a test market research to see what came back, and then you would make an approach on that basis. So there is,
you can also see whose face is appearing on the front of magazines, can't you, for particular audiences where
absolutely. And social media is can be a really good gauge. There's no science to it. So when I was commissioning a lot of TV tie-ins, obviously you have access to television viewing figures. Good television viewing figures doesn't necessarily equate to good book sales, and the same is true for online presence. So one of the biggest social media people in the world, probably about 5 years ago, was a guy called PewDiePie, and his book just didn't work at all in the UK. Yet, Alfie Days, who was the first influencer in the UK to do a book, did really well. Not a lot was paid for it, and did really, really well. So you can't always kind of equate the two things to each other, but it is helpful. It can be. I once looked at the most influential people on Twitter, and this is a few years back, but as a result of that, book was commissioned and did very well. So that.
Okay, well, I've got two final questions for you. I mean, you mentioned Victoria Wood, who's very sadly no longer with us. Whose autobiography would you really like to well, perhaps two questions, to read or to work on? Who would you like to work on?
So Victoria Wood was my number one, and David Bowie was my other one that I always wanted to do. They're both dead now, so neither of them are going to do it. Now you've put me on the spot. I'm rubbish at these sort of questions, like what's your favourite, this or that. Does anybody else want to offer there who they'd like to read?
Victoria Wood would have been my number one choice, actually. J.K. Rowling, Nairet's saying.
Yeah.
Well, the second question was, and you can just think about the first one, was would you actually write an autobiography, having been part of so many other people's? Would you feel tempted to do it yourself?
To write, I would never write my own autobiography. It would be the most tedious and boring story that could possibly be told. I would enjoy, one thing that I would kind of be interested in is working with somebody else. I haven't even got onto the topic of ghostwriters and how many of these autobiographies obviously are not written by the supposed author. And again, this came up in one of the earlier talks about people who do, and I have heard it go on TV and say, I never read my autobiography. So working with somebody on their autobiography is something that I would really enjoy doing, sort of going into that area. But
I did meet Andrew Croft, who's come and spoken to our course, and he said it's just the most fantastic license to ask really nosy questions that you want to know the answer to. He just sort of goes straight. So Emma, you came into publishing with the one job that all our publishing students have heard of, which is an editor, and you've explained the different roles. Do you want to send a message to our publishing students who are arriving very shortly, and journalism and media as well?
Well, I feel very privileged to have been able to spend my whole career in editorial. It's, as you say, it's the job that people think they know what it is in publishing, and when people think of publishers, they think of editors. But if I look back, I really enjoyed it. And one of the really nice things about editorial is that relationship you build with an author. But I think I ended up in editorial. I left, I did a postgraduate diploma. I was applying to a range of different jobs. I ended up in my first job slightly by chance, in that I was kept on file and then approached by BBC. So I'd applied for a different job. I think I could have been just as happy in quite a lot of different areas. I think I would have enjoyed marketing. I think I would have enjoyed rights. I think there are lots of other areas I actually could have had just as happy a publishing career as I have as an editor.
So your basic message is publishing is great fun.
Publishing is great fun, and I feel very lucky that now I can still do a bit of publishing and a bit of teaching, which I also enjoy, and I'm able to combine the two. So.
Well, it's a great combination as far as our course is concerned, isn't it? Because it means that we're talking about how to do things practically, but also we've got really good contacts with what's going on. And you've certainly expanded my understanding. You've told me of all sorts of programs I'd never heard of. So just to give a quick thank you very much. That's been really insightful and lovely to hear about how to do your job. Next week, which is our final talk, is Professor Jason Piper. He's the head of our school, who's going to be talking about the chapter where she meets the Chippendales, which was one of my favourite chapters, actually. So do join us again next Wednesday. It'll be at 11 o'clock that day. We're doing it at different times so that we can reach different audiences. Kingston is a very international place. We've got students coming from all over the world, some of them not coming immediately, others coming now. And so we do it at the two different times so that we reach as many of them as possible. But Emma, that's been fascinating. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And we'll hopefully see everybody next week for our grand finale. And and one other thing, that Emily Maitlis herself will be doing an event with us. She's going to America. She's the lead correspondent on the North American election, but as it's looking as if there won't be a result immediately, because it'll either be contested or still in the post being counted, she could be there for quite a while. So a whippet-free and a sun-free existence. Thanks very much indeed, Emma.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks.